I would like you to please raise your hand if you have ever heard or seen or read any of the following phrases. Doublethink, Newspeak, Ministry of Truth, Big Brother is watching, or Big Brother is always watching. Now keep your hand up if you know where it's from. That's almost everybody. Fantastic, that's exactly what I wanted, good. These are all from 1984, in case anybody was not sure. 1984 is one of the earliest, not the earliest, but one of the earliest, and one of the most influential works of dystopian fiction ever created. And there's very, very good reasons for that, which we'll get into in a moment. But I just wanted to start out by showing you guys, if anybody looked around when the hands were going up, almost everybody had hands up, because it is so deeply influential. Even if you have not read the book, you have probably heard at least one of the phrases that was on the screen somewhere. And we'll come back to some of these phrases too, by the way. But before we go any further, we need to be clear about what it is that we are talking about. What are our definitions here? What is a dystopia? Literally, dystopia means bad places, from the Greek. It's defined as an imagined world or society in which people lead wretched, dehumanized, fearful lives. It is the opposite of a utopia, a perfect world in which everyone lives in peace and harmony and prosperity. For this presentation, I have analyzed a number of dystopian works of fiction, mostly novels. I have stuck to the imagined part. So although there are some regimes in the past and in the present that could legitimately be called dystopian, I have not included those works in this presentation. So for example, Ayn Rand wrote We the Living, set in the early Soviet Union. You can certainly call that setting dystopian, but because it is based on a real-life regime, I have not included it here. But just so we're clear on that. But what really, I think, helps us to start looking for the positive values in dystopian fiction is that we're dehumanized. What does that mean? How do people start to rise up against it, if they even do? How do they realize that there's even a problem in the first place? These kinds of questions will start to help us drill down into what the value there is in these works. But broadly speaking, why dystopia? Why talk about it? Why read it? Why write it, for that matter? Often dystopian fiction is described as a warning, as a way to say, if we keep going down this path, this is what could happen. And it is a warning of sorts, because people are imagining the worst that could happen. But just because a person has written a dystopia does not mean that he or she has a mystical insight into what our society should and shouldn't do. Alan Moore, who wrote V for Vendetta, wrote, inevitably, if you are creating a painting or writing a story, you are making propaganda, in a sense, for the way that you feel, the way that you think, the way that you see the world. You are trying to express your own view of reality and existence. And this is true, I think, of every form of art, across barriers, across languages, across cultures. Everyone, in a sense, is expressing their own views, their own premises, their own philosophy. So this means that works of fiction are widely varied in their values. Although I will be talking about a lot of dystopian fiction generally, just bear in mind, this is that I'm referring mostly to what I would consider good works of dystopian fiction. I will highlight several of them as we go. And also bear in mind that if there's a dystopia that doesn't sit right with you, doesn't make sense to you, doesn't resonate with you, it may be because the author's premises are flawed. They are starting from an incoherent worldview. They are starting from something that doesn't make sense. But we will not focus on that. We will focus on the positives for this presentation. And I would also like to say that I think dystopian fiction can go beyond being a warning. It can provide many deep, serious values and provide even an example. So, to get more specific, what we'll talk about for most of the rest of the presentation is the actual values that you find in a lot of dystopian fiction. The covers that you see on the screen behind me are ones that I will use a lot. They're not the only ones I'll use. They're not the only things I read. I'll have a full reading list at the end. But these are ones that I pull through a lot. These are examples of what I would consider excellent dystopian fiction. And most of them have at least 3 of the values, if not more, present in them that are listed on the screen. I would also like to note that there are some works of fiction, series, etc., that have dystopian elements or like periods within a series. Like if you look at the later books of the Harry Potter series, there are certain dystopian elements there. Mostly I haven't relied on that, with the exception of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. You will see where it comes in as we go. So big values that I think you find a lot in dystopian fiction, because the setting, the way that people deal with the topic, kind of opens it up to it, and you'll see how as we go, are independence, liberty, integrity, justice, self-esteem, and valuing itself, specifically valuing life. That's a little meta, but I think I will explain it when we get there. And some of the main ways that you see this in dystopian fiction, firstly, by contrast. That's the obvious one, right? People do not have these values. The society they're in makes it very difficult for them to achieve these values. And so we see what happens if those values are not there. And that is obviously a very bleak way to show the value, but it is a way. But when we usually have some contrast, from the contrast, if you will. We have a protagonist, a character, maybe a group of characters, who is looking for the value, who has realized that something is missing here and is trying to find it. And in the dystopian works that have actual heroes, we even have people who are fighting for these values. And that's where I think the strongest examples can come from. But even people who simply are discovering it and looking for it, and maybe they never succeed, that's where we get our tragic dystopian fictions, even that, their thought processes, their battles, the things that they go through, I think can be really, really valuable to us. And I know some of you have come to the liberty movement or the self-development movement very much from a fact-based perspective. You love reading nonfiction, you come with all of your statistics and your facts, and you're like, this is what works, and it's what works for you. But there are a lot of people who connect more deeply to stories, whether those are personal stories or dystopian fiction, or any other kind of fiction. There was a really interesting study that was done. It was replicated a couple of times, but the basic format was this. They had a control group that was not shown anything. Then they had a group that was shown news clips of real-life injustices. And then they had a group that was shown clips from the Hunger Games movies. After this, each of the groups was given a hypothetical scenario with a political injustice occurring, and asked how willing they were to take action, or what kind of action they were willing to take. In each of the 3 repetitions, the group that was shown the clip from the Hunger Games was more willing to take action, and more willing to take drastic action. Again, that is a statistical average, and if you're sitting there thinking, that's not me, I understand. But there are a lot of people for whom fiction is a very, very powerful means of conveying ideas. And these are some really powerful ideas that can be conveyed through this genre. So, without further ado, independence. Independence, as Ayn Rand described it, is the recognition of the fact that yours is a responsibility of judgment, and nothing can help you escape it. But I think it will not surprise anyone here when I say that tyrannies and those wishing to control others do not appreciate having a bunch of independent thinkers. They are harder to rule. So we see in dystopia education and cultural practices that actively undermine not just those who are already thinking outside the box, but the actual ability to think, the ability to question ideas, the ability even to understand certain concepts. Some really strong examples of this, I think, are in 1984 and Brave New World. Bear with me for just a second while I briefly summarize the relevant points for those who are not familiar. In 1984, for example, you have the 2 minutes hate. You have people who stand in front of a screen, everybody has to stand in front of a screen, 2 minutes every day, and scream vitriol and hate for the country's enemies. And what does this do? It gets people into a frenzy, it gets them thinking emotionally, it gets them so angry and worked up about people they have never met, people they have no business with. That is one of the ways. There's also, I mentioned newspeak at the beginning. This is the new language that the party encourages people to use, and it is a pared-down language, a language that does not contain concepts such as freedom, concepts that people could potentially use to challenge the regime or to commit what they call thought crime. When they're not even able to think in these terms, or not even encouraged to think because they are all run by emotion, then you have people who would not dream of questioning the regime because it would just literally never occur to them. Brave New World goes even further. In Brave New World, you have people who are, nobody is born like via natural birth. They're all grown in test tubes. Everyone is genetically engineered. You also have people being conditioned from birth. Everybody is raised by the state. They are conditioned to hate studying, to hate reading, to love only play and pleasure. It is the hedonist form of trying to control people. And whether or not you think that's a very realistic way of controlling people, the point is that nobody in Brave New World is encouraged to think outside the box, or even many of them are not even able to think outside the box. Even the protagonist, I would say, is not really actively challenging the orthodoxy. He just doesn't like what's around him. He wants to be different because he wants to be different. He doesn't know why. Which is not being independent, it is just being second-handed with extra steps. There are some dystopian fictions that focus on the results and display beautifully what happens when you have a culture full of people who do not think for themselves. I think perhaps one of the best examples of this is Fahrenheit 451. Again, if you're not familiar, I'm sorry if you read this in school. People are not allowed to read anything beyond basic technical manuals in Fahrenheit 451. Books are burned. And the result, and it's not just books that are burned, it's people are not engaging in serious narratives in any form. They are not watching movies that are intelligent or TV that's intelligent. They are constantly listening to nonsense. And the results, you have people who are deeply unhappy. Suicide attempts are very common. Violence, both between individuals and towards animals, is very common. Deep relationships are non-existent, not even with your spouse or your children. Never mind with a friend. And most people alternate between mindless thrills and apathy. Now, obviously, that is the culture gone to the extreme. Again, this is what dystopian fiction is for. It's for taking everything to the far end, to a stylized version. But you can see that you can extrapolate backwards and notice that people who are not thinking for themselves on a smaller scale, just in their personal lives, also have these results to a lesser extent. A common feature in dystopian fictions is surveillance states to one degree or another. Big Brother is watching. Or I often hear it now as Big Brother is always watching, but the original phrase is Big Brother is watching. And this refers to the state, specifically to technology constantly surveilling you. I think somebody mentioned that at the social last night. And the thing with surveillance states is not just that they violate your privacy. If you are constantly watched for everything you say, everything you write, then you are not even able to think to the extent of what your mind is capable of. You are not able to consider things that would be considered bad or crimes or against the party or the orthodox in your country. The surveillance already starts to hem you in and put bounds on your thinking. From a plot perspective, you start to have, typically, a character or a couple of characters realize something about their society. They realize something is missing. They realize something is corrupt. They realize there's a problem. They realize they could take action. But, by definition, this sort of realization takes them away from everyone around them. Either the other people around them don't know, or they don't care. Or they think it's too risky to take action. So now these people have to make a choice for themselves. They have to think for themselves of necessity because they no longer have the group that they were used to. And although this is often a little bit scary, a little bit lonely at first, what typically ends up happening is the characters build confidence in themselves, they start to build confidence in their own minds, and they gain a sense of agency. Now, in tragic dystopian fiction, sometimes that agency is kind of crushed. But in the ones with happier endings, or the ones with heroes, you end up having people take that agency with them into the new era, if you like, even if that doesn't necessarily mean that the tyrant is vanquished. Now, I've been focusing on the thinking side of independence, which is a very important side, but there is also the physical side of independence. Typically, when you say, like, oh, she's a strong, independent woman, it means she produces enough to take care of herself. She manages her own business, right? And when you are in a tyranny, they're very often socialist. They're very often, the state is going to take care of you from the time you were born until the time you die, sometimes literally. And this creates a physical dependence. People they can't conceive of living outside the state. Any thoughts of perhaps running away, absolutely quashed because they would die. They would starve. Now, this is not always true, but it's very often, you see it in the Hunger Games, you see it in Brave New World, you see it in 1984. People would not even consider running away because they are physically dependent on the state. And I'm sure you can draw parallels to the real world pretty easily. So, independence. I think it will not surprise some people in this room also that liberty is a value you see in a lot of dystopian fiction. Again, I've been talking about tyrannies as being the most sort of common, overarching way of referring to the governments in these works. Not every single one, but the vast majority. Now, some of them emphasize that the tyranny did not take place like overnight. They didn't take over by force. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But the cultural groundwork was prepared first. In Fahrenheit 451, most people stopped reading before it became illegal. In The Handmaid's Tale, the religious group, that they did take over by force in the end, but they were already on TV. They already had a huge following before they tried to take over. So there's the cultural danger there. There are also various aspects that you see, I think, fairly commonly both in the real world and in dystopian fiction about tyranny. Sorry, I'm using the mic badly. About tyrannies. But one that I specifically want to draw your attention to is the arbitrariness of many of these regimes. For example, in V for Vendetta, the police do not, the graphic novel, not the movie, guys, just they're completely different, so you know. The police don't have any rules on how they deal with certain crimes. They can do whatever they want. Same thing in 1984. Technically, nothing is illegal. There are no rules. But this is just a front so that the party can make the rules whatever they want. And this arbitrariness is not accidental. It is a way of trying to make people conform in their very thinking, in their actions, before there's any mass disturbance, because they don't know how the state will respond. So better to stay in line with the party, better to follow the orthodoxy. It's safer, right? So this, again, affects the way that people are thinking, the way that they are living from the very beginning. In most, I would say most dystopian fiction, to at least some extent, you have a character or a few characters who either already value liberty or, more commonly, who learn the value of liberty through something that happens in their lives, something that makes them confront the fact that they don't have control over their own lives and they want it. And this can be very powerful, a very powerful way of showing people the value of liberty and inspiring people to fight for liberty. Just a few examples, really. I could have probably made a much longer list, but The Giver is a young adult dystopian novel where people do not have memories of what's been taken away from them. One boy gains these memories and realizes things like seeing color, things like choosing your own job, things like choosing your own spouse. These things have been taken away from them, and when he realizes that, he realizes what they have lost. It takes away the risk. It makes the society safe and stable, unless you are a dissident, then it's not safe. But it also takes away people's individuality, their choice, their agency. And this, he realizes, is not a good trade, and people should be able to decide for themselves. The Hunger Games trilogy, we'll go more into depth with this later, but Katniss Everdeen is the protagonist there, and she is not naturally a rebel. She doesn't start out wanting to take down the tyranny that is the capital. But what she is from the beginning is somebody who deeply values her life and the lives of her loved ones. And eventually she realizes that she cannot continue to build a life she wants, that she cannot continue to protect her loved ones in a tyranny so complete and so dangerous. And that's what leads her to rebel. Matched is another young adult dystopian trilogy. And as the title suggests, the key element of that society is that people are very carefully matched to their future spouses based on all of their data, which has been compiled from the time they were born. So again, surveillance state coming in and choosing people's spouses for them. And through a slightly cheesy love triangle, the main character realizes that she actually wants to be able to choose who she spends the rest of her life with. Absolutely crazy idea, right? But this is her sort of waking up, and she's a teenager. She has grown up in this society. Oh, sorry. She's grown up in this society her whole life, but this is her awakening. This is how she realizes that liberty is something that matters to her deeply and personally. So, just a few examples there. Sorry. Okay. Integrity. In other words, loyalty to your principles. Consistent, coherent loyalty to your principles. In V for Vendetta, oh, it's cut off my attribution there. The quote is from The Hunger Games. Sorry, you can't see it. The main character in V for Vendetta calls integrity the very last inch of us, because he notes that when you have a tyranny You have people who are going to try to force you to behave in certain ways, who are going to coerce you, who are going to put you in very difficult circumstances. But when you make the choice that aligns with your values, every time, to whatever extent you can, in those circumstances, whatever your context is, then you are acting in line with your values, then you are acting with integrity. And it's that last little choice that makes the difference morally when you have no others. I don't think, actually, incidentally, that V is a very good example of that, but nevertheless, he described it poetically. There are definitely examples in dystopian fiction where the characters do not hold on to their integrity. In case anybody hasn't read 1984, I will not spoil the ending, but at the end, I think Winston betrays his integrity. Of course, that was the point. However, in the Hunger Games, I think you have various pivotal moments where Katniss holds on to her integrity. I think this makes her one of the reasons that I think she's a very strong hero. One of those moments is in the very first Hunger Games, so again, bear with me for those who are not familiar, I'm sure most of you will be. The Hunger Games trilogy centers around an annual event in which 2 children from each of the 12 districts fights to the death until only one is left. This is an effort to intimidate the districts into not rebelling ever again. Of course, this also means that life is viewed very cheaply, and people are forced to do that when they're in the games. Katniss, competing in the games, ends up allying with a young girl called Rue. When Rue is killed, the survival thing to do would have been to grab her gear and run away as quickly as possible, not stayed in the vicinity where the killers knew that she was. But that's not what she did. She made a ring of flowers for Rue. She stayed with her as she died. She put flowers on her chest. You can't see it very well in the picture, but she's put flowers all around her as a small memorial for this young life that was lost too soon. And she reflects, I want to do something right here, right now, to shame them, to make them accountable, to show the Capitol that whatever they do or force us to do, there is a part of every tribute they can't own. That Rue was more than a piece in their games, and so am I. And that phrase, more than a piece in their games, comes up multiple times with the heroes who are trying to maintain their integrity when their whole lives have been taken over by the Capitol. They are trying to find that last inch of them and hold firm to it. And in that sense, whenever they do that, they have a moral victory, even if they don't have the actual physical victory there in the moment. Right then, that moment didn't change anything politically, except that a few more people were willing to rebel. A few more people saw how awful the games were. Katniss had the moral victory then. The physical victory didn't come until much, much later. Let's cut off my slide again. Justice. I think it will not surprise anybody if I say that tyrannies are unjust. Who knew, right? But I want to talk a little bit more about some of the ways that dystopian regimes are often portrayed as being unjust and some of the reasons for that, and then we'll get a little bit more into the personal side. So the obvious thing is many tyrannies, many regimes in dystopian novels ban things that don't hurt anybody else. And again, real-life governments often do this to some extent as well, but usually in dystopian fiction you have it to a crazy extent. I already mentioned Fahrenheit 451 with the banning of the books. You also have in The Handmaid's Tale, for example, women are not allowed to drink or smoke or read or watch TV or listen to music. It's quite a long list. Other examples, like I said, in some regimes, the laws are deliberately kept quite vague and hazy, but in some of them it's very clear. In the Match trilogy, there are only certain songs, books, stories that they are allowed to look at. Anything outside of that is contraband. So banning things for normal things that don't hurt anybody else. And the purpose of this is not just to be awful, it is to create criminals, to create guilt, to create people you can persecute. In the words of one of Ayn Rand's villains in Atlas Shrugged, when there aren't enough criminals, one makes them. And this is another method of controlling people. When you have to sneak around to do something that's perfectly sensible, that creates this guilt, this sense of needing to be underground. Censorship. Again, different tyrannies censor to different extents, different contexts. Some of the dystopian regimes, I think what they're doing is so far beyond what we consider censorship, it's not even close. In Fahrenheit 451, like I said, people can only read like technical manuals. In the Match trilogy, there are only 100 stories they can look at, 100 poems they can look at. Anything outside of that is banned. And again, the purpose of that, A, making criminals, making people that you can, heretics if you like, and that you can blame the state's problems on, scapegoats. And B, forcing people's thinking to be smaller, keeping them inside a box mentally and not just physically. When you have also very extreme dystopias, it makes it very difficult for individuals to judge one another, just on a personal level. Because how should you judge people, really, on a deep moral standard? You want to judge people basically on how they act, on what they say, on what they do. If what they say and do is so very carefully conscribed, and you have so few moral concepts left to you, basically the only standard that is left on a culture-wide scale is whether they are in line with the party or not, orthodox or not. You see this particularly in Brave New World. The protagonist there is ostracized because he doesn't want to be super promiscuous and play games all the time. He wants to go out and see other parts of the world and to do other things. Again, he's kind of whiny and not very pleasant. So not a hero by any stretch, but somebody who thinks outside the box, and he's ostracized for it. In Philip K. Dick's sci-fi novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is the very loose inspiration for the movie Blade Runner, everyone is expected to follow it's not a state-backed religion, but the most common religion, which is Mercerism. Everyone is expected to own an animal, because doing so, caring for an animal cultivates empathy, and they revere empathy. And if you don't do those things, you're ostracized, you're looked down on. Even though owning an animal is very expensive, so really only a few people can properly afford, especially a large animal. And as that last part was kind of hinting at, when you have these really extreme dystopias that force people to behave in certain ways, it makes personal justice between individuals extremely difficult. Both for the reasons I just said, but also because the authorities typically will create divisions that are based on superficial things, based on things that do not matter, to set people against each other. This takes all kinds of forms. There's the obvious rich against the poor. In 1984, the citizens are divided into the masses, who are called the proletarians or the proles, the outer party, and the inner party. In The Handmaid's Tale, the women are divided up into the Marthas, who do the cooking and cleaning, the handmaids, the wives, and the Akana wives, who have to do everything. Not work, though. They're not allowed to work or to read. And these women, if they were to get together, could easily overthrow the government, but instead, they resent each other, they hate each other, they look down on each other. For no good reason. And in The Handmaid's Tale, we can see how this just makes people's lives that much harder. The handmaid that we follow her perspective from, we never learn her real name. She wants to be friends with the Marthas in her house. They seem like nice ladies. They want nothing to do with her. She has essentially no friends because of this arbitrary line that the government put down for them. In the Match trilogy, again, we have the citizens who are set apart from the aberrations and anomalies. Anomalies sounds very dangerous and strange, but it's just people who opted out of the society when it started. But you have to make them sound dangerous so that people will not go near them and realize that there's an alternative. Aberrations are people who have broken the rules. Again, dangerous, right? People must not be allowed to get too close to them because that could spark something. And when we have heroes, sometimes, they realize how awful and useless these divisions are and start to break through them, start to reach out to people who are on the other side or in one of the other groups. You have some examples of that in Matched. I think you have a particularly powerful one in the Hunger Games, where the division, there's some division between rich and poor, mostly in the first book, but more so it's between the districts. And the districts, there's nothing fundamentally different about a person who lives in District 11 and does farming for a living and a person who lives in District 12 and mines for a living. They're both people who work for their living, honest individuals. But the capital pits them against each other with the games, with keeping them apart. And toward the end, during the rebellion, Katniss is in District 2 with a man from District 2 pointing a gun at her. And he says, "Tell me why I shouldn't pull the trigger." She says, "I can't. But I won't shoot back. I'm done killing the capital's slaves for them." He says, "I'm not their slave." She says, "I am. That's why I killed Cato, and he killed Thresh, and he killed Clove. These individuals are all tributes. And she tried to kill me." It just goes around, and who wins? District 12 and District 2 have no fight except the one the capital gave us. that man stood down. Again, it was not only the moral victory, but the physical victory followed. People started to realize that she has a point. It is not District 2 or District 12 that is causing the problems for us. It is the capital, it is the tyranny. And until we realize that, we cannot make any changes. Self-esteem, Agnieszka, I hope I am not preempting your talk too much. But much like it is difficult for rulers to control people who think for themselves, it is also difficult to control people who genuinely believe and have good reason to believe that they are worthy of success, that they are moral, that they deserve to be happy. Because people who believe those things genuinely and have good reason to will fight for them. So just a few examples. This is not showing up terribly well, but a couple of examples of ways that they do this. And again, I'm sure Agnieszka will go into much more detail, not focusing on fiction. But you have, firstly, controlling natural desires. Sex is the obvious one. If you try to make people feel guilty for wanting to sleep with somebody, assuming the other person is a consenting adult, then people start to, again, feel like maybe they're not as good as they thought they were. Maybe they're not good. Maybe there is something wrong with them because they don't want to sleep with the person the government assigned to them. You see this in 1984. You see it in The Handmaid's Tale. You see it in Ayn Rand's novella Anthem. Trying to get people to not want things that they naturally should want alienates them from themselves in a very serious way. Another example you see in some dystopias, not all of them, is trying to make people complicit in the crimes of the regime. This not only makes people feel, again, like they're not moral, like they don't deserve to be happy, but also makes them feel like they are a part of what's going on. A number of examples. In The Handmaid's Tale, there are at least two. So the picture from the TV adaptation, I guess is over here. The woman in the center has confessed to having been raped when she was younger, and all the rest are slut-shaming her for it. That term wasn't around when Handmaid's Tale was written, but that's essentially what they're doing. They're making her feel guilty for something she had no control over. And they also have the handmaids help deal with, they're usually political prisoners, but the women are told that they are rapists, and they are essentially beaten to death. And afterwards, the narrator, again, I mentioned we don't know her name, reflects, I'm not proud of myself for this or for any of it. But then that's the point. They are trying to make the women complicit. They are trying to make them part of the problem so that they feel like they can't turn around and change things. And when you have heroes, again, I would say you do not always have heroes in dystopian fiction, but when you have a hero, one of the things they'll often do is realize, I was forced into this. That was not actually something that I was made to do, and it's not a part of me. It's not part of my principles or my ideas. I would say probably to a lesser extent, you also have the firemen in Fahrenheit 451. So again, that's the one where all the books are banned. And so firemen don't put out fires, they start them. They're the ones responsible for burning the books. And if the owners of the books don't get out of the way, then them too. And again, until the firemen realize that this is a problem, that they ought to be thinking for themselves and encouraging people to read books, to explore different perspectives, to share stories, to share facts, until that happens, they cannot possibly hope to start a new life or step into a new era. I'm sure Agnieszka will get more into the psychology later today. In all of these dystopias, no matter how confined they are, how restrictive they are, there is fundamentally a lack of value for life. Sometimes this is for just physically being alive. Go back to 1984, you have people who are sent to war for no reason over and over again, just to keep the population down, essentially. But also for life in the broader sense of what actually is a human life. A life where people can think and make decisions and build things for themselves. And this paper here described it as such. As protagonists awaken to the realities around them, they feel an overwhelming sense that life has lost the value it once had in the world. Respect for life has been sacrificed for comfort or security. This is something they're describing, these authors, as being something that tends to shock the protagonist the most fundamentally. If you look across many different examples of dystopian fiction. In one form or another, they're shocked by the horror, the cruelty, the just wanton disregard for life, and the apathy of the masses. You cannot have any other deeper values, any more abstract fundamental values, until you have a value for life. Life is both what makes values necessary and what makes them possible. Obviously, you can't value anything if you're not alive, but also why should you have any values at all? Because you want to, again, physically remain alive, but also build a wonderful life. Build a life that's full of things you've chosen, things you thought about, things you care about. And that starts with people caring about life. But also valuing itself. Making choices, choosing something and going after it. I don't know how we're doing on time. Oh, pretty good, okay. So a couple of examples. In 1984, famously, sex is described as a political act. And when I first heard that, I was like, what does that even mean? But what it means is that people have chosen to value their partner and themselves, at least the pleasure for themselves, if not anything deeper, in opposition to what the regime has chosen for them, the party has chosen for them. In 1984, sex is only supposed to be a thing for procreation with your party-approved spouse. And if you're going outside of that, you are valuing yourself and potentially the other person. And that is dangerous. It's a political act. In Ayn Rand's novella Anthem, she goes a bit further. Choice and preference, totally forbidden. You don't choose your partner, you don't choose your job, you're not supposed to even want a different job than the one you're assigned. You're not allowed to have friends, you're not allowed to have any romantic partners whatsoever. And in Anthem, the hero goes outside of that. He hopes for a job, a particular type of job, and he pursues it in secret when he's not allowed to have it. He makes a friend. He falls in love. He chooses to value things. And that's fundamental. That's what makes him different. That's what makes him a hero. That's what makes him stand out. Again, The Hunger Games, I think, so Anthem is a short novella, and you see this take place over 100 pages or so. In The Hunger Games, you see it happen over a whole trilogy. Again, I mentioned before, Katniss was not planning to be a rebel. She just wanted to stay alive and to protect her family, especially her sister, Prim. And at one point in the second book, she is contemplating potentially linking up with the rebels or running away, and key in her considerations, she's thinking, I can't let the Capitol hurt Prim. And then it hits me. They already have. They have killed her father in those wretched mines. They have sat by as she almost starved to death. They have chosen her as tribute, and then made her watch her sister fight to the death in the games. Prim, Rue, aren't they the very reason I have to try to fight? To be able to protect the ones she loves, to be able to build her life, to be able to simply to live, she needs a much greater measure of freedom than what the Capitol allows. And this ultimately is what pushes her to fight against it. And I think that's part of the reason that The Hunger Games was so, probably most of you are old enough to remember, they were very popular when they first came out, and they sparked a whole trend of young adult dystopian fiction. And I think fundamentally this is why. It's because Katniss is a valuer, and she values something that a great many of us value. Her family, a couple of close friends, that's what she wants. Most of us can relate to that. Most of us hope we would fight as hard for our loved ones as she does. So, to wrap up, dystopian fiction obviously is a warning, but it is also, in the best cases, an example. It is a way we can see a number of values. The ones I listed are ones that I think are particularly common and important, but you can probably think of others if you've read dystopian fiction. And it shows those values both by taking them away, by having some characters learn the value of them and look for them and seek for them, and in the cases where we have heroes, characters fighting for those values. So it is, in short, not just a warning, but an example for us all to follow. Thank you.